Today we're hosting the UK ambassador to Latvia, Mr. Polu Bramelu, and we will be discussing the impact of social media on the political process, the war in Ukraine, the opportunities and possibilities for peace, and the ways Latvia can build soft power. So we kind of start hot off the press. I was preparing for the interview today in the morning, and I found, a piece of news which I'm surprised people are not picking up. So as far as I understand, at the moment, the UK government is working through a legislative measure, which is Protect the Internet Act or something like this. And then as part of the measure, Rishi Sunak's government is considering to introduce responsibility of platform owners like Facebook, LinkedIn, for harm that they would cause to children or could cause to children, right? And then, as you probably know, in today's environment, we say that, platforms are platforms, everybody can post on the platforms, and then people should be responsible for whatever they post themselves on the platforms. But then this overall impact is not really it's like the problem of the commons, right? The proverbial, field with the grass is it just happened, right? And I was very surprised how easy it is. It's just, maybe we're going to get introduced. So how do you see that from your experience perspective? Would it be a good measure? Why this type of a simple thing to do, which would protect children, takes so much time to discuss?
I think it's one of the big balancing acts of our time, actually. The UK, as a basic standpoint, is a country which believes in freedom of expression. We believe in freedom of the press, and we believe in an open internet. And we believe in those things because you see the consequences, what happens in places where those things don't exist. You have authoritarian regimes which manage access to information for their citizens. We're seeing something rather similar in Russia at the moment, for example. But nonetheless, you can't have, there have to be some checks and balances because there are risks in any system of exploitation. Not everybody who uses the internet is doing so in a benign way. There are very vulnerable people using the internet, children, minors, for example. And that's why the online harms bill is focused on making sure that children can use the internet in a safe way to avoid being exploited by the internet. And that means that organizations who provide access to the internet, organizations providing crucial access to the internet, have to bear some responsibility. They can't simply provide a free for all. And so I think that the online harms bill, I can't comment definitively. It's still going through Parliament, yes, so there are still views, there are still amendments being made. So I'm not sure exactly how it will turn out. But I think the discussion we're seeing in Parliament at the moment, it's a very important discussion, and it's a discussion about trying to get that balance right between preserving freedom of expression, preserving an open internet, but actually making sure that we're also safeguarding people, including vulnerable people who use it and need it.
What fascinates me is that this is typically not a mainstream discussion, because also in the case of the UK, the backbenchers have forced it on the government to consider this, right? Because, this is an important question, right? It is a pretty clear question. So, and then also if we look in the case of the US, all of the main platforms are actually asking, please, consider and introduce certain regulation. Do you see it in the same way? Do you see that, we're not trying maybe to regulate what could be regulated?
I think broadly speaking, I think you're right. Actually, my impression, I'm not an expert personally, but my impression from what I'm reading is that actually most of the platforms are asking for clarity, to tell us what our responsibilities are. So I think, the fact that there should be some level of responsibility is actually acknowledged. Of course, there are differences of perspectives. I mean, there's money involved as well as principle, but I think, there's no dispute over the fact that this is a legitimate thing for governments to be looking at, and that some degree of regulation is important and indeed necessary around this area.
And from your perspective, you're specialized in soft power, and you've written about soft power. How much did unregulated social networks had an impact on the political process over the last 5-10 years? So where do you see the real impact that they had versus imaginary or noise about them actually having an impact?
I think the impact of social networks actually is huge, and I'd see this just from my very narrow perspective as a head of a diplomatic mission. Thinking back when I was first appointed ambassador, 20 years ago, it was quite a quirky place to be appointed ambassador. It was in Turkmenistan, which even today it was not,
Turkmenistan.
Yes, exactly. It's not a country which has a straightforward relationship with social media by any means. But actually, for my colleagues around the network, we still did things like issuing press releases that we wouldn't really consider doing now. And now, in that 20-year time frame, the way that we as a diplomatic mission engage with our host countries has transformed. We're much more focused on social media. It's the embassy Twitter site or Facebook page is the way we communicate, and it's the way journalists communicate with us. They pick up what we're posting on Twitter or Facebook. And so social media has become much more a driver of news. Big accounts have millions of viewers, but it drives news in a way that is not quite as clear as the conventional press. People's social media accounts are kind of echo chambers where what they see is dictated by who they follow. So actually it filters out a lot of news. So they get quite a distorted view of the news. There are, unfortunately, and we're seeing that in Russia's behavior at the moment, a lot of malign actors in social media who are deliberately putting out stories that they know to be untrue in order to try and manipulate people's views. So there is a lot of risk, there is a lot of danger around social media. So it has become really important, but we have to understand that it doesn't actually behave like conventional news.
And that's also kind of a topic that I always look at, because if you take the classical John Stuart Mill argument that you have to give people an opportunity to speak up, because eventually it is much worse if they don't, right? And if we look at the right-wing or extreme left-wing politicians within the European Union, do we really do a good job in making sure that we are open to views which are opposed to the majority of center right and center left? For example, in COVID, it was pretty clear that some sort of openness from both sides would be welcome.
I think looking at the political landscapes in very many countries, I think that there is, if anything, more of a spectrum these days. I think social media is perhaps part of it. It's certainly by no means the whole answer. I think the crises that have struck, the COVID pandemic, for example, maybe another factor. But I think the kind of political discourse has favoured the emergence of views on the far right or the far left, or a kind of populist views in a range of places. That doesn't mean they've become in the ascendancy everywhere. Obviously we had Mr. Trump in the United States, Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil. We did have some figures emerging in this landscape, but in others they have become sort of powerful, but not government voices. But I don't see, I don't see any kind of real tendency towards homogenization. If anything, I think something of the reverse actually over the past few years.
And then maybe switching topics a little bit, talking about Brexit. So there were different expectations, different plans about what could happen, should happen, after Brexit, especially once Brexit was a fact or the decision was a fact. There were scenarios of Singapore on Thames type of approach, or Japan being close to China approach. How do you see that developing today in the UK political discourse? So what maybe are kind of more realistic assessments of how UK would like to position itself vis-a-vis Europe, and then how do we make sure that we face the new challenges that Europe faces? You can exit the EU, but you cannot leave Europe in a sense, right?
Absolutely, nor do we want to. We are a European country. We are a European power. We're very happy with that. We are happy with our geography. I think. What would I say? I mean, I think that Brexit fundamentally, certainly from the perspective of our government, was around taking back control, or making sure that decisions can be made by lawmakers in the United Kingdom for the United Kingdom, meeting the needs of the United Kingdom. And I think certainly the government has made clear that its objective is to kind of refashion the legislative base to give us a set of legislation that enables a high growth ambition, but while maintaining regulatory standards. It certainly won't be a kind of bonfire of the regulations where those regulations are necessary and play an important role. But the government's ambition is certainly that it is something that is facilitative. But Europe remains enormously important to us. So we want to see a successful UK working in tandem with a successful European Union. We want the countries of the European Union to remain key trading partners. And more than that, we want to remain partners with the EU and its member states across a whole range of agendas, because our values, our ways of looking at the world, our ways of looking at the challenges that the world is facing, from energy scarcity to climate change, are very similar. And because, as the events of recent years have shown, this is a pretty tough time in a pretty tough world. So we need our friends and allies at the moment. So we need to be working together.
And if we compare UK approach and policy and maybe strategy vis-a-vis the Baltic states today, and then when the UK was part of the EU, so did anything change? And if something changed, then what is it?
I think actually, in large measure, we have a pretty similar way of looking at the core economic challenges as here in Latvia. So, I think both countries, by inclination, largely speaking, are countries supporting a free trade, relatively sort of deregulated sort of approach, or regulation only where necessary and only where it adds value. So I think there is a commonality. And when it comes to areas like defence and security, obviously there is a huge commonality, and we see the security of our continent in very similar ways. We're working extremely closely in confronting Russian aggression in Ukraine, and that close relationship will absolutely be set to continue.
So what do you think about the military aspect of the same cooperation? Because I guess one of the points that we clearly see from the Russian aggression is that Europe is not really, strong, army-wise, military-wise, right? And then a lot of countries have not been investing into their military equipment. We can see that there is a lot of rusty equipment. we don't have necessary personnel, both military and civilian. And then there was always this discussion about, the EU army, or whatever it would be then the name, or NATO. How do you think this should develop going forward?
So the UK and Latvia, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, were in the same club as members of NATO, already devoting more than 2% of our GDP to defence. We've always prioritised defence and security. We're delighted that the UK is the lead nation in Estonia, providing the enhanced forward presence in Estonia, supporting the security of the eastern flank of NATO, and clearly following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that work has intensified. Just on Monday, our Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, announced the provision of a whole lot of military equipment to Ukraine, spearheaded by a squadron of Challenger 2 tanks. So, our commitment is strong. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated the areas where NATO member states need to focus, where they need to modernise their defences. And I know Latvia has responded to that. For example, in identifying a key need to get an improved solution around things like medium-range air defence. So there is a lot of work going on. I think there is even more investment going on in armed forces. I mean, not just in countries like ours, which have always been doing it, but actually in some of the countries which before Russian invasion of Ukraine were spending rather less on defence. I think most of them are now upping their game. We have Sweden and Finland both applying to join NATO, which I think is hugely positive. So I think, Putin has achieved a lot of, in many ways, a lot of the reverse of what his objectives presumably were, because I think he is seeing a NATO which is very united, very clear and very robust.
Well, I'm not sure if we're staying on the topic of the war. There is a book by a British historian, as far as I remember, called Sleepwalkers, about the First World War, right? And the argument in that book is that it happened, in sleepwalk, right? That most of the leaders of that time, which were, both the czars and elected leaders, they just, kind of casually walked in without understanding the consequences of the war, even if the Russian-Japanese war clearly indicated that the losses will be 10 times, 1,000 times bigger than the typical European 19th century war, right? So sleepwalking into the war. A great book. And then how do you see, how this war happened? Did we sleepwalk into it, or?
No, I think the circumstances are very different. And actually, I think the Russia-Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is in some ways unusual in modern conflict, or particularly striking in modern conflict, because it is so clear-cut. It is not a kind of muddled, not quite clear what happened or who's at fault here. It is actually an example of naked aggression of one country.
It is.
Completely unlawfully invading the sovereign territory of another one. And actually, I think that's why the UK is so clear about what it is that we need to do, and I know our view is absolutely shared by Latvia, that this circumstances of this conflict are so clear that what we must do is support Ukraine.
Yeah. I think, eventually in World War I, it was also very clear who started the war, but then the whole discussion in the book is that, everything that was before the actual start were actions by lots of politicians which didn't really calculate in that what we're dealing with is the worst war up to that point in history, and the level of responsibility that they would carry into their decisions, what in hindsight was sleepwalking.
I think, even ahead of, in early February 2022, where, there was a lot of intelligence which was presented, which showed quite clearly that Russia was amassing forces on the Ukrainian border. But even then, armed with all of that information, a lot of the most respected analysts were looking at this information and saying, surely they're not going to attack. And the reason for such skepticism is very sensible in many ways. It's not quite unimaginable. It's not clear what Russia really hoped to gain by doing so. If they wanted a regime in Ukraine which was more supportive of Russia, the last thing you would want to do is invade Ukrainian territory and ruin the lives kill ethnic Russian or Russian speakers in eastern parts of Ukraine closest to the Russian border. So it was never going to achieve Russia's objectives. So the skepticism of many commentators was quite clear. So I think that's why I think the West can be forgiven for not quite predicting exactly what was going to unfold. But I think, looking back at the events of 2022, I think the response was more robust, certainly than Putin expected, but I think than many people in the West expected. It was more united, it was clear, and it has been maintained right through 2022 and into 2023. We have a key meeting just about to take place in Ramstein, for example, around continuing enhanced provisioning for Ukraine. And so I think that degree of unity and solidarity is in no doubt. It's being maintained.
If we try to talk about peace, right, then all wars they do end. And if we again compare it to World War I and World War II, right, then an argument can be made that the Allies won World War I, but then lost the peace because the peace provisions they led to the continuation, or as Churchill said, it was actually one war, right? And if we look at World War II, then there is also an argument can be made that the Soviet Union has won World War II, but then lost peace, right? So winning the war and winning peace, are two different things, and the arrangements after the war, they can actually lead to a next war. How do you see? How should we think? Maybe not even shape, because we're probably far away. How should we think about the peace arrangement, peace treaty? Assuming that potentially when the war will stop, it will be just a stop. It will not be a peace treaty, and then there may be a longer journey to a treaty. How should we think about that from your perspective?
I mean, obviously there are so many unknowns at this stage that you can't say anything with confidence. But I think it is possible to identify some key considerations. I think the first thing is that nothing should be done over the heads of the Ukrainians. This is their country, and a peace settlement must be something that Ukraine is fully happy with and engaged in and involved in. So I think that's crucial. I think another important consideration is that the aggressors, those who are responsible, have to pay for what they've done. I think that there's a lot of discussion now around a tribunal, around the form in which a reckoning will take. Of course, it's important to think about the international order, about the well-being of the international community, and hopefully a future in which Russia, a different sort of Russia, can be a friend and a partner in that international community, because that will be important. So there is an awful lot to think about. But the first step is, of course, that Ukraine needs to regain its territory. It needs to be successful in repelling the Russian invasion.
Thank you. Then if we kind of take this a little bit forward, as far as I remember, after the end of the Second World War, so one of the first kind of peace plans was to ensure that Germany remains unindustrialized. Right, and this was up for about 2 years, and then the Marshall Plan only arrived after that. And then the Marshall Plan arrived after that, once the Allies understood that it's not going to work, right? It doesn't work economically, it doesn't work from country perspective, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm kind of trying to be conscious of these types of experiences. And then what are those realistic conditions around which should we shape, especially European security, maybe not even world security, but European kind of convent of security, which would provision or envision that Russia at some point in time, as you said, renewed Russia, but would be part of that peaceful Europe.
So I think these are really crucial conversations to have. I think we're not at the point where we can sort of say meaningfully what that will look like, or what the terms are likely to be. As you say, I mean, historical experience shows us this is really important, and this is really, really difficult. And actually forging peace out of conflict is not an easy thing to do, and it's a vital task for the international community. I think that there are already some steps along the glide path which are important. The United Kingdom will be hosting a Ukraine reconstruction conference, for example, later this year. So there are venues where we will start to have this conversation. I think it will be as important to maintain a kind of international solidarity and a clearness of vision around the peace, as we have done around the conflict and responding to Russian aggression. But the detail, as I say, is conversations which still need to emerge.
And then maybe as we draw to the end, so one of the fictitious UK PMs in a movie Love Actually, he said that Great Britain is a country of Harry Potter, of David Beckham's left leg and right leg. So it's a question about soft power, right? And of course, the UK is a country with a lot of very famous, for example, footballers, right? And if you think about soft power for a much smaller country with a much smaller potential of producing an impact on people's imagination, like Latvia. So how do you think we should shape, realistically speaking, not being able to kind of pretend that we are, as strong as the UK? How should we shape our own soft power?
Well, the great guru on soft power is a US academic come politician called Joseph Nye. Yeah. And he says, soft power is essentially how a state secures influence, not through its military might or its economic might, but how a state secures influence by being attractive to other states. For other states think, that country is really nice, they're really good, I like them, I want to work with them. This is his basic idea. And he says there's three things which make up a country's soft power. One of which is its culture, the second is its values, and the third is how it behaves internationally. So I think the task for Latvia is to look at yourselves in that way. What is it about Latvian culture that is attractive internationally? And I think you've got some amazing things. I'm really looking forward to the Song and Dance Festival later this year, which I think is just an amazing showcase of kind of national unity through the medium of choral singing. What better example of soft power could there possibly be than that, I think. The second thing is values. So it's about making sure that Latvia stands for values which are attractive to other countries. What Latvia thinks and what it stands up for is stuff that people think, they're right, they do good stuff. And finally, international behaviour. It's about behaving positively on the international stage.
Thank you for those insights.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
It's lovely talking to you.